Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to be discussing a mysterious explosion that may or may not have happened within World Trade Center Building Number 6 on September 11th, 2001. The only way I was even able to come across this information was based off of my curiosity, specifically regarding the time frame in between both of the Twin Towers being hit and them falling. I wanted to see a damage assessment of the World Trade Center buildings within the complex before both towers collapse. The backstory on the World Trade Center Building 6 is nothing particularly special. We all know Buildings 1 and 2 were both the Twin Towers, Building 3 was the Marriott Hotel, and Buildings 4, 5, and 6 were 8 to 9 story commercial office buildings with an unremarkable exterior. They all looked practically identical. If you were looking at the World Trade Center complex from an aerial vantage point, it would almost seem like buildings 4, 5, and 6 were connected based on how similar they appeared. I do want to focus, though, on building number 6, then in particular a time frame within both of the towers being hit, but before they collapsed. The main purpose of Building 6 was to house government agencies, including the Department of Commerce. When Flight 11 struck the North Tower, the first plane to hit either of the Twin Towers, large pieces of falling debris were reported to have hit World Trade Center Building Number 6. The building suffered structural damage to its roof and to its upper floors. There were also reportedly fires inside the building. Speculation is they were caused by fallen jet fuel. At some point, after the first impact, but before either of the Twin Towers collapsed, there was reported to be a large explosion inside World Trade Center number 6. Eyewitnesses describe a massive crater-like hole appearing in the center of the building. Aerial imaging later showed exactly that, a crater hole in the center of the building. This sparked speculation about what potentially could have caused it, and remember, this is a finite timeline in between both of the towers being hit, but before they collapsed, because at this point, technically the complex surrounding the Twin Towers is still relatively intact. When both the buildings came down, that's when the surrounding structures get totally trampled by the Twin Towers debris. Experts say the reason for the crater in WTC Building 6 was due to a partial interior collapse from falling debris and structural damage. At that point, the fallen debris would have had to have come from the plane impacts and things ejecting out of the towers, which did technically happen. The surrounding buildings were also hit with certain debris, whether it's plane parts or the Twin Towers building material, but not to a wide scale. It's important to note that neither buildings 4 or 5 had a massive crater in the middle of them, even though they were identical. Now, this could be explained as, who knows how debris is falling. Some buildings get hit harder than others, but it is curious that Building 6 in particular, before the collapse of both towers, because when both towers come down, those smaller 8 to 9 story office spaces are going to be just obliterated, and you're not going to be able to tell anything. Another key difference when it comes to comparing buildings 4, 5, and 6 were the tenants of the building. Buildings 4 and 5 were mainly commercial offices as opposed to Building 6, which was mainly federal government offices, including the U.S. Customs and the Commerce Department. It's led to speculation that the initial explosion heard possibly was done on purpose in an effort to get rid of highly classified materials. Building 6 had a clear difference from 4 and 5. It housed sensitive government agencies dealing with financial law and international trade. Of course, to a degree, it does seem a little bit ridiculous, the idea that they would plant something in this building in what could be a more widespread conspiracy that would mainly be focused around the Twin Towers, but it is interesting in hearing some of the first responders and the eyewitnesses describe what they heard, including firefighters saying they heard a powerful explosion within building number 6 before or around the collapse of the North Tower. So maybe almost simultaneously, but the key point there is the idea is it was before the collapse of the North Tower. And also, you really wouldn't have an explosion coming from World Trade Center Building 6 even during the collapse of the North Tower. The other big part of this story that has been disputed would be the crater which you wouldn't think would be a product of the falling debris from either the North or the South Tower. There were also a few eyewitnesses that were near the complex and described a bright flash before the explosion, although this has been debated and it is not widely documented in official reports. Some people theorize it was what was stored in Building 6 that potentially caused Building 6 to receive that massive crater. Maybe the weapons, explosives, or flammable chemicals that could have been stored inside Building 6 by customs may have ignited. The debris pattern of the giant crater within World Trade Center Building 6 suggests more of a vertical collapse rather than a typical debris impact. Aerial photos taken before much of the cleanup began show a symmetrical, deep hole in the middle of the building. If it really was debris from the North Tower, the structure would likely look more collapsed or pancaked, not a clean, deep crater. I do want to point this out, and maybe I should have done this earlier in the video. I am talking about Building 6, not Building 7. Obviously, Building 7 has been widely discussed in terms of why it fell on the afternoon of September 11th. Building 6 gets a lot less of attention for obvious reasons, as it was thought of as almost identical with Buildings 4 and Buildings 5, and was certainly a lot smaller than Building 7. I just made this video because I didn't even know this existed. I guess the idea of people reporting an explosion within Building 6, I found it fascinating. I have heard of a significant amount of eyewitnesses that have heard certain explosions before the collapse of the Twin Towers, and I would assume that this is one of those. I just never heard this particular story of an explosion happening inside the building, which creates a particular crater. The entirety of the building's walls were still intact and together, but the crater completely destroyed the center of the building. The South Tower collapsing would likely have very little effect on World Trade Center Building number 6 because of where it was located within the World Trade Center complex, as you can see from an aerial shot. Of course, after both towers collapsed, all bets were off in terms of the debris fields and the wreckage within the complex. You can see from aerial shots the interior of Building 6 with the crater still there and what looks to be many materials from the North Tower sprawled out through the lower levels of Building number 6. After the Twin Towers collapsed, Buildings 3, 4, 5, and 6 were all heavily damaged and later demolished as a result of the fallen debris. The Marriott Hotel was originally split in half by the South Tower and then virtually completely crushed by the North Tower. 4 World Trade Center was virtually completely destroyed beyond recognition. 5 World Trade Center partially collapsed and was later demolished, and 6 World Trade Center had the giant crater, although all the exterior walls were still up and still together, but it was later demolished.